He refused to hold her. For 3 weeks, my husband walked past the nursery as though our daughter did not exist, and I learned that a woman can bleed from wounds no physician will ever see. I remember the day I arrived at Ravenswood Hall as though it were painted in watercolors behind my eyes, the edges soft but the colors still vivid after all this time. The carriage had rattled through iron gates that groaned with the weight of centuries, and I had pressed my face to the window like a child, desperate for my first glimpse of the house that would become my prison, and eventually my salvation. It rose from the mist like something born of ancient stone and older secrets, its towers piercing a sky the color of bruised plums, its windows glinting with the last amber light of a dying afternoon. I was 19 years old, newly married, and so full of hope that I thought my heart might burst from the pressure of it. My father had arranged the match, as fathers did in those days when daughters were currency and marriages were transactions dressed in white lace. He was a baron of modest means and immodest ambitions, and he had maneuvered for years to place me in the path of suitable men with titles grander than our own. The Duke of Ravenswood had been the prize beyond all prizes, a man whose fortune could swallow my family's estate 100 times over, and whose name carried the weight of 3 centuries of English aristocracy. That he was young and handsome and possessed of all his teeth was merely a bonus, my father had said with a laugh that did not quite hide his relief. I had met the Duke only twice before our wedding. The first time was at a ball given by the Countess of Ashworth, a glittering affair where I had worn my mother's pearls and my best white gown and tried desperately not to trip over my own feet. He had asked me to dance with all the warmth of a man requesting directions to the nearest exit, his hand at my waist formal and distant, his eyes looking somewhere over my shoulder throughout the entire waltz. I had stammered through attempts at conversation, asking about his estate and his horses and the weather, and he had answered in monosyllables that fell between us like pebbles into a deep well, disappearing without trace. The second time was in my father's study, where contracts were signed and my fate was sealed with ink that smelled of iron and obligation. Sebastian, the Duke, had barely looked at me during the entire proceeding. His solicitor had done most of the talking, outlining settlements and jointures and provisions for future children in language so dry and legal that I felt less like a bride and more like a property being transferred from one ledger to another. When it was done and the papers were signed, Sebastian had bowed to my father, nodded once in my direction, and departed without a single word of farewell or anticipation. I told myself that he was merely reserved. I told myself that aristocratic gentlemen were not raised to display their emotions openly, that beneath his cold exterior there surely beat a warm heart waiting to be discovered. I told myself that I would thaw him, that love could grow in even the coldest soil if only one were patient enough to tend it. I was young, I was foolish. I did not yet understand that some men build walls not to keep others out, but to keep themselves from escaping the prisons of their own making. The wedding itself was a blur of white lace and orange blossoms, and the curious stares of hundreds of guests who had come to witness the unlikely union of a minor baron's daughter with one of the most powerful dukes in England. Sebastian had been handsome in his formal attire, dark and stern and impossibly remote, and when he slid the ring onto my finger, his touch was cool and impersonal, as though he were performing a particularly tedious piece of business rather than pledging himself to me for the rest of our lives. I had searched his eyes during the ceremony, desperate for some flicker of warmth or recognition or even mere acknowledgement that I was more than a contractual obligation, but I found nothing there but ice and the faint reflection of my own desperate hope. The wedding breakfast was interminable. The guests ate and drank and made toasts that I barely heard, my attention fixed on my new husband who sat beside me like a statue carved from marble, beautiful and cold and utterly unapproachable. He spoke when spoken to and smiled when smiles were expected, but even a girl as inexperienced as I was could see that these were merely the movements of a masterfully trained actor playing a role he had long since ceased to believe in. And then came the wedding night. I will not speak of it in detail, for some things are too private even for the confessional of memory. I will say only that Sebastian came to my chambers as duty demanded, and that he performed his husbandly obligations with a mechanical efficiency that left me feeling emptier than I had ever felt in my life. He did not speak except to ask if I was comfortable. He did not linger afterward, rising and dressing in the darkness with movements that suggested long practice at similar departures. And when he left, closing the door softly behind him, I lay in my marriage bed and stared at the canopy above me, and wondered what I had done to deserve such careful, courteous contempt. The carriage ride to Ravenswood Hall the following day was 7 hours of silence, broken only by the rattle of wheels and the occasional comment about the scenery that neither of us seemed interested in discussing. I tried in those long hours to engage Sebastian in conversation about his home, about the estate, about the life we would build together. He answered my questions with the same cool politeness he had shown throughout our acquaintance, offering facts without feeling, information without intimacy. By the time the great house appeared on the horizon, I had run out of questions, and he had run out of patience for answering them, and we sat in separate corners of the carriage like strangers sharing a public conveyance. But oh, the house itself! Even in my misery, I could not help but be awed by Ravenswood Hall. It was a palace in everything but name, a sprawling monument to wealth and history and the enduring power of old blood. The main house was Elizabethan in origin, all red brick and mullioned windows and towering chimneys, but generations of Ravenswoods had added their own contributions until the whole structure was a mad jumble of architectural styles that somehow cohered into something magnificent. There were wings and towers and courtyards, gardens and greenhouses and stables, a lake that gleamed like polished silver in the fading light and parkland that stretched as far as the eye could see. "This is your home now," Sebastian said as the carriage rolled to a stop before the main entrance, and they were the first unsolicited words he had spoken in 3 hours. "I hope you will be comfortable here." Comfortable. Such a cold word, such a measured expectation. Not happy, not loved, not cherished. Merely comfortable. Like a well-upholstered chair or a fire that burned at a satisfactory temperature. I thanked him with what grace I could muster and allowed him to hand me down from the carriage, his gloved fingers releasing mine the instant my feet touched the gravel drive. The household staff lined up to greet me in the great hall, their faces arranged in expressions of careful neutrality that I would later recognize as a skill honed by years of serving a master who tolerated no excess of emotion. There was Mrs. Blackwood, the housekeeper, whose silver hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the very skin of her face. Her eyes were sharp and assessing, and I felt myself examined and catalogued and filed away in some mental ledger of household concerns. There was Mr. Holloway, the butler, ancient and immaculate, who bowed to me with the precision of a clockwork figure and welcomed me to Ravenswood, in a voice like dry leaves rustling across stone. There were maids in starched aprons and footmen in livery, kitchen staff and gardeners and grooms, all of them watching me with eyes that held questions they would never dare to voice. And there, standing apart from the others, like a crow among sparrows, was the Dowager Duchess. Sebastian's mother was a woman who seemed to have been carved from the same stone as the house itself, ancient and enduring and utterly without warmth. She wore mourning blacks despite the 7 years that had passed since her husband's death, the jet beads at her throat catching the candlelight and throwing it back like tiny accusations. Her face was a masterwork of aristocratic bone structure gone sharp with age and disappointment, her eyes the same frost gray as her son's, but without even the pretense of civility. She did not smile when I curtsied to her. She did not offer words of welcome or maternal warmth. She simply looked at me, her gaze traveling from the hem of my traveling dress to the top of my carefully arranged hair, and I felt myself weighed and measured and found wanting before I had spoken a single word. "I see you have arrived," she said, and her voice was music played in a minor key. "I trust your journey was not too taxing." The roads from London can be quite tedious at this time of year." I thanked her and said something polite about the countryside, some vapid observation about the beauty of the autumn leaves that I had barely noticed through the carriage window. But she had already turned away, gliding toward the staircase with a rustle of silk that sounded like whispered warnings. I stood in that vast hall with its portraits of Ravenswood ancestors staring down at me from their gilt frames, and I felt the first cold finger of doubt trace its way down my spine. What had I married into? What kind of house was this, where even welcome felt like judgment? Sebastian showed me to my chambers himself, a concession to propriety that he performed with the same distant courtesy he showed in all things. The rooms were beautiful. I could not deny that. There was a sitting room decorated in pale blue silk, a bedroom with a massive four-poster bed hung with damask curtains, a dressing room with wardrobes large enough to hold 10 times the modest trousseau I had brought with me. The windows overlooked the formal gardens, a maze of hedges and fountains and graveled walks that stretched toward a wood in the distance. "These were my mother's rooms," Sebastian said, standing in the doorway as though reluctant to enter. "She had them redecorated after my father passed. If they do not suit you, you may change them as you wish." I thanked him and said that they were lovely, which they were, and asked if his rooms were nearby, which seemed a reasonable question for a new bride to ask. Something flickered in his eyes at that, something I could not identify, and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "My chambers are in the east wing," he said. "Tradition. The Duke's apartments have always been there. I will not disturb you." And with that, he bowed and withdrew, leaving me alone in my beautiful prison to unpack my bags and wonder what I had done to earn such careful avoidance. That first dinner set the pattern for all the dinners to follow. The dining room was cavernous, the table long enough to seat 30 guests, and we sat at opposite ends like generals surveying a battlefield from their respective camps. The dowager presided from the middle, equidistant from both of us, her presence a constant reminder that whatever intimacy might have developed between Sebastian and me would always be observed, always be judged, always be found wanting. Candles flickered in their silver holders, casting dancing shadows on walls hung with tapestries depicting hunting scenes and classical myths. The food was excellent, the wine was plentiful, and the silence was so thick I could taste it on my tongue, bitter as unripe fruit. I asked about his day, about the estate, about the tenants whose livelihoods depended upon his management. He answered in monosyllables, his attention fixed on the food before him as though the roasted pheasant held secrets more interesting than anything I might offer. I asked about his mother, and he looked up then, his frost-colored eyes meeting mine for one brief moment before sliding away again. "She is adjusting to your presence," he said. "Give her time." I wanted to ask how much time. I wanted to ask why adjustment was necessary at all, why a mother would not welcome her son's bride, why the very air of this house seemed to crackle with tensions I did not understand. I wanted to ask 1,000 questions that pressed against my lips like birds beating against a window. But I had been raised to be agreeable, to smooth rough edges and fill awkward silences with pleasant observations about the weather or the quality of the wine, and so I swallowed my questions along with the food I could barely taste and smiled until my face ached from the effort. That night, he came to my chambers. I had been sitting at my vanity, brushing my hair with strokes that had grown increasingly slow as the hours crept past, when I heard his knock. My heart leaped into my throat and lodged there, pounding so hard I was certain he must be able to hear it through the heavy oak door. I called for him to enter, and he did, still dressed in his evening clothes, though his cravat had been loosened and his hair was slightly disheveled, as though he had been running his fingers through it in agitation. He stood just inside the doorway, watching me with an expression I could not read, and I rose to meet him on legs that trembled beneath my nightgown. The fire had burned low in the grate, painting the room in shades of amber and shadow, and in that uncertain light he looked almost soft, almost approachable, almost like a man who might one day learn to love me. "I know my duty," he said, and his voice was rough, scraped raw by something I did not understand. "And I will do it. But you should know that I do not intend for this marriage to be anything more than what it must be. I require an heir. You require a home and a title. Let us not pretend that there is anything more between us than mutual necessity." The words struck me like stones, each one leaving a bruise on my heart that I knew would take years to fade. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him that I had hoped for more, that I had dared to dream of affection growing into something warmer, something brighter. I wanted to ask what I had done to earn such coldness, what sin I had committed that made him look at me as though I were a burden to be endured rather than a wife to be cherished. But his eyes were so cold, so utterly devoid of any flicker of tenderness, that the words died in my throat, and I simply nodded, mute and miserable, as he crossed the room to extinguish the remaining candles. What followed was not cruel. I want to be clear about that. Even now, even after everything. Sebastian was not rough or callous in the physical act itself. He was simply absent, his body present, but his spirit somewhere far away, locked in whatever fortress he had built around his wounded heart. When it was over, he rose without a word, dressed in the darkness, and left me alone in my marriage bed, with nothing but the cooling sheets and the salt taste of tears I refused to shed. This became the pattern of our early marriage. Days of polite distance, evenings of strained dinners with his mother's watchful presence, nights of dutiful coupling that left me feeling more alone than any solitude ever could. I learned to navigate the vast halls of Ravenswood like a ghost, present but unseen, my footsteps echoing on marble floors that had witnessed centuries of joy and sorrow and everything in between. I learned which rooms were mine to enter and which belonged to the shadows of Sebastian's past. I learned that the East Wing, where his chambers lay and where his first wife had lived, was locked and forbidden, its doors sealed against a history no one would speak of in my presence. His first wife. Ah, yes, I must speak of her now, though the very name feels like poison on my tongue even after all these years. I discovered her existence not from Sebastian, who spoke of his past as rarely as he spoke of anything personal, but from one of the housemaids, a young girl named Nell who had not yet learned the careful silence that the older servants wore like second skins. She mentioned her ladyship one morning while helping me dress, referring to some preference in the arrangement of flowers, and then clapped her hand over her mouth as though she had uttered the most terrible profanity. I could have let it pass. I probably should have let it pass, should have allowed the forbidden topic to sink back into the silence from which it had briefly emerged. But I was lonely and desperate for any scrap of information that might help me understand the enigma I had married, and so I pressed Nell gently, kindly, promising my discretion and my protection if she would only tell me what she knew. The story came out in fits and starts, whispered confidence shared over the following weeks as Nell and I developed something approaching friendship. What I learned made the cold behavior of my husband suddenly, terribly comprehensible. Her name had been Vivian. She had been the daughter of an earl, beautiful and vivacious, the diamond of her season, with hair like spun gold and eyes the color of summer cornflowers. All of London had been at her feet, but she had chosen Sebastian, and he had fallen for her with all the passion of a young man experiencing his first great love. Their courtship had been brief and blazing, a whirlwind of balls and garden parties and stolen kisses that scandalized the chaperones and delighted the gossips. They had married in a ceremony that was the talk of the season, and for 2 years, Ravenswood had rung with laughter and music and all the sounds of happiness that I had never heard within its walls. Then the rumors began. Whispers at first, easily dismissed as the jealous mutterings of rivals who envied Vivian's position. But the whispers grew louder, became more specific, took on details that could not be so easily explained away. Vivian had been seen in the company of a certain Lord Ashworth, a man known for his charm and his complete absence of moral scruple. She had been observed entering his carriage, had been spotted in his box at the opera when Sebastian was away on business, had been the subject of sly smiles and knowing looks that made their way inevitably back to Ravenswood. The servants had known before Sebastian did. They always do, those silent witnesses who move through great houses like shadows, seeing everything and saying nothing. They had seen the strange visitors who came to call when the Duke was away, the letters that arrived in unfamiliar hands and were quickly hidden, the flushed cheeks and disheveled hair that spoke of afternoons spent in something other than rest. But loyalty or fear or simple self-preservation had kept their tongues still, and so Sebastian had been the last to know what everyone else had already guessed. He had confronted Vivian on a night that the older servants still spoke of in hushed voices, a night of screaming and crashing and sounds of violence that had sent footmen running for the magistrate before Mrs. Blackwood intervened. What exactly had passed between husband and wife, no one could say with certainty, but the outcome was clear enough. Vivian had confessed everything, and she had done so with a cruelty that seemed designed to wound as deeply as possible. She had never loved him, she said. She had married him for his title and his fortune, had endured his tedious attentions only because they came with the privileges of a duchess. She had taken her pleasure where she found it, which was anywhere but in his bed, and she was not sorry, would never be sorry, because he was a cold and boring man who deserved exactly what he had gotten. And then, the final blow. The child she carried might be his or might not. She neither knew nor cared, and frankly, she hoped it was Ashworth's, because at least that man knew how to make a woman feel alive. The child was lost before it could be born. Some said it was nature's cruelty, the common tragedy that visited so many pregnancies in those days of limited medical knowledge. Others whispered of darker possibilities, of herbs obtained from disreputable sources, of a woman so desperate to sever all ties with her husband that she would destroy even the life growing within her rather than be bound to him by a child. Vivian herself fled to the continent with Lord Ashworth before the scandal could fully erupt, leaving Sebastian alone with his shattered heart and his ruined trust and a wound that had never properly healed. She died 2 years later in Italy, of a fever or a broken heart or simple dissipation, depending on which version of the story one believed. Her body was never returned to English soil, and Sebastian refused to speak of her at all, had forbidden her name to be mentioned in his presence, had locked away the East Wing as though by sealing off the physical spaces she had occupied, he could seal off the pain she had left behind. Now I understood the ice in his eyes when he looked at me. Now I understood why he kept such careful distance, why he performed his husbandly duties with all the emotion of a man completing a distasteful but necessary task. He was not cold by nature, I realized. He was frozen by choice, encased in armor forged from betrayal and pain, and he would rather suffocate inside that prison than risk being wounded again. I wish I could say that understanding made it easier. It did not. If anything, it made the loneliness worse, because now I could see glimpses of the man he might have been, the man he perhaps still was, somewhere beneath all that ice, and I wanted desperately to reach him while knowing that he would never allow it. I tried, in those early months, to show him that I was different. I was attentive without being cloying, affectionate without being demanding, patient and kind and everything a good wife should be. But every gesture of warmth was met with polite retreat, every attempt at intimacy deflected by courteous distance. He did not want to know me. He did not want to love me. He wanted only to fulfill his duty, produce an heir, and return to the frozen solitude he had chosen for himself. The months passed in their stately procession. Winter came to Ravenswood with all its bitter cold and early darkness, and I spent long hours by the fire in my sitting room, reading novels and writing letters to a sister who seemed impossibly far away. I took meals with the dowager when Sebastian was occupied with estate business, which was often, and I learned to endure her pointed comments and subtle cruelties with a smile that never reached my eyes. She was clever, Sebastian's mother, in a way that I came to appreciate only with time. She did not attack directly. She did not say outright that I was unworthy of her son, that my family was beneath them, that my presence in her home was an insult she could barely tolerate. Instead, she asked innocent questions about my upbringing that highlighted its modesty. She made helpful suggestions about my clothing and hair that somehow always left me feeling inadequate. She told charming stories about Vivian, about her beauty and her grace, and her perfect suitability for the position I now held. And she watched with sharp eyes as each word landed like a drop of acid on my already fragile confidence. I should have fought back. I should have stood my ground, asserted my place, demanded the respect due to the Duchess of Ravenswood, regardless of what fortune had placed me in that role. But I was young and alone, and desperate for any scrap of acceptance, and so I allowed her to chip away at me piece by piece, hoping that if I was submissive enough, agreeable enough, small enough, she might eventually accept me. She never did. Spring came at last, thawing the frozen grounds and bringing the gardens back to trembling life. I discovered the greenhouse during one of my solitary explorations, a vast glass structure tucked behind the formal gardens where exotic plants had once flourished under careful cultivation. It had fallen into neglect since the previous Duchess's departure, its beds overgrown with weeds and its glass panels clouded with years of accumulated grime. But I saw potential in its abandonment, saw a project that might occupy my hands and my mind, and give me something to nurture when everything else in my life remained stubbornly beyond my reach. I threw myself into the restoration with a fervor that surprised even me. I enlisted reluctant gardeners and ordered seeds and bulbs from London and spent hours with my hands in the soil, coaxing life from earth that had grown cold and barren. There was something healing in the work, something that spoke to the deepest parts of my wounded spirit. These plants did not judge me. They did not find me wanting. They simply grew if I tended them well, offered beauty and life in exchange for water and sunlight and patient care. Sebastian noticed the change in my routine, though he said nothing about it. I caught him watching me sometimes. From the windows of his study or the paths of the formal garden, his expression unreadable as I knelt in the dirt with my hair coming loose from its pins and my dress streaked with green. I wondered what he saw when he looked at me. I wondered if he saw anything at all, or if I was merely furniture to him, another fixture of the house that moved occasionally but required no particular attention. It was in the greenhouse, on a morning in late April, when the tulips I had planted were just beginning to bloom, that I first suspected I might be with child. The knowledge came upon me slowly, a growing certainty that built from missed courses and morning illness and a tenderness in my body that I had never experienced before. I sat among my flowers with my hands pressed to my belly, feeling nothing yet but imagining everything, and I let myself hope for the first time in months that things might change. A child, an heir for Ravenswood. Surely this would bridge the chasm between Sebastian and me. Surely this would give us common ground upon which to build something that might, in time, resemble love. I sat with the knowledge for 3 days, turning it over in my mind like a precious stone, examining it from every angle before I dared to speak of it aloud. I wanted to be certain. I wanted to choose the right moment. I wanted to present this news in a way that might crack Sebastian's armor, might reach the wounded man beneath, and show him that there was still joy to be found in this cold marriage. I told him on a Tuesday evening, in his study, while rain lashed against the windows and the fire crackled in the grate. He was seated behind his massive desk, reviewing estate accounts, and he looked up at my entrance with the mild irritation of a man interrupted from more important matters. I stood before him like a petitioner before a king, my hands clasped to hide their trembling, and I spoke the words that I had rehearsed 100 times in my mirror. I am with child, my lord. You are to be a father. For one moment, one fraction of a heartbeat, I saw something flicker in his eyes. It might have been joy. It might have been hope. It might have been the ghost of the man he had been before Vivian destroyed him. But then it was gone, shuttered behind ice and stone, and he simply nodded once and returned his attention to his papers. "I see," he said. "I will have Mrs. Blackwood arrange for a physician to attend you. You should rest more and avoid strain." That was all. No embrace, no word of happiness, no acknowledgement that we had created something together that might bind us closer than any marriage contract ever could. I returned to my chambers and wept until I had no tears left, and then I dried my face and placed my hands on my still flat belly and made a silent promise to the life growing within me. "You will be loved," I whispered into the darkness. "Whatever else happens, you will be loved enough for both of us." The months of my pregnancy were a strange kind of purgatory, suspended between hope and despair. My body changed in ways both wondrous and alarming, my waist thickening and my breasts growing heavy and my skin taking on a glow that the maids remarked upon with shy smiles. I felt the first flutterings of movement in my 5th month, like butterfly wings against the inside of my belly, and I pressed Sebastian's hand to the spot without thinking, desperate to share this miracle with someone. He pulled away as though I had burned him. The Dowager, meanwhile, had begun a campaign of whispers that I did not fully recognize until it was too late. She made comments at dinner about the uncertainty of such things, about how one could never be truly sure until the child was born and its features could be examined. She mentioned the incident at the Winterbourne ball with poisonous casualness, remarking on how attentive Lord Thornwood had been, how closely he had danced with me, how intimately we had conversed in the corner by the refreshment table. I had nearly forgotten that evening, lost as it was among so many other disappointing social events. But the Dowager had not forgotten. She had watched and catalogued and stored the information away, and now she wielded it like a weapon, planting seeds of doubt in her son's already suspicious mind. It was innocent, I wanted to scream. It was a dance and a conversation and nothing more. But I could see the poison working in Sebastian's eyes, could see the old wounds reopening under his mother's careful ministrations, could see him retreating further and further into the frozen wasteland of his distrust. He stopped coming to my chambers entirely, no longer bothering with even the pretense of husbandly attention. He took his meals in his study or with his mother while I ate alone in the vast dining room, surrounded by empty chairs and the weight of accusations I could not disprove. The whispers spread beyond the walls of Ravenswood. I heard them when I ventured into the village, felt them in the curious stares and sudden silences that followed me wherever I went. The Duchess of Ravenswood, they said. Pretty enough, but common blood, and that scandal at the Winterbourne ball, dancing twice with Lord Thornwood while her husband was in the card-room. Barely 3 months married and already straying. It was not true. None of it was true. But truth, I learned, matters very little when gossip has taken hold. The story was too delicious, too perfectly constructed to be abandoned merely because it happened to be false. A young wife, a cold husband, a handsome admirer, a convenient pregnancy. It wrote itself, and no amount of protest from me could change the narrative that had already been established in the collective imagination. I retreated into my greenhouse, into my books, into the growing life inside me that was the only thing keeping me from utter despair. I talked to my baby as I worked among the plants, telling her stories about the world she would be born into, making promises I was not certain I could keep. "I will protect you," I said. "Whatever they say about you, whatever doubts they try to cast, I will protect you and love you and make sure you know your worth. You are mine. You are wanted. And one day, your father will see you truly, and he will know that you are his as well." The birth came early, in the darkest hours of a February night, while a storm raged outside, and the wind howled like a chorus of mourning women. I had been restless all day, plagued by an aching in my back that grew steadily worse until it became clear that my time had come, ready or not. Mrs. Blackwood sent for the physician and the midwife, and bustled about with hot water and clean linens while I gripped the bedposts and tried to remember how to breathe. The pain was unlike anything I had ever imagined. It came in waves that threatened to drown me. each one stronger than the last, until I was certain that my body would simply tear itself apart and there would be nothing left of me but blood and bone and the echo of my screams. I called for Sebastian, begged for him to come, needed his hand in mine even if his heart was forever closed to me. But he did not come. The door to my chamber remained shut against the storm within and without, and I labored alone except for the women who attended me, bringing my daughter into a world that had already begun to reject her. She was perfect, small and red-faced and furious at being expelled from her warm sanctuary, with a cap of dark hair and tiny fists that flailed against the indignity of birth. She screamed her outrage at the cold air and the bright lights, and I laughed through my tears and gathered her to my breast and felt my heart crack open in a way I had not known was possible. This fierce, tiny creature was mine. Whatever Sebastian believed, whatever the dowager whispered, this child was the best thing I had ever done, and I would spend the rest of my life protecting her from a world that could be so unutterably cruel. I named her Charlotte, after my mother who had died when I was young, and I waited for Sebastian to come and meet his daughter. He did not come that night. I lay in my bed, exhausted and torn and triumphant, holding Charlotte against my heart and listening to the storm slowly die away outside my windows. Every creak of the floorboards made me look toward the door, hoping to see Sebastian's tall figure silhouetted against the hallway light. Every footstep in the corridor sent my heart racing with anticipation that curdled into disappointment when the steps passed by without stopping. He did not come the next day either, or the day after that. The physician came, prodded and examined me, pronounced me recovering satisfactorily and the child healthy despite her early arrival. Mrs. Blackwood came, efficient and unsentimental, arranging for a wet nurse that I refused, and additional help that I reluctantly accepted. The dowager came, peering at Charlotte with sharp eyes that searched for signs of illegitimacy in every curve of her tiny face, and departed without a word of congratulation or welcome. But Sebastian did not come. A week passed, then two. Charlotte grew and changed with the astonishing speed of newborns, her features becoming more defined, her eyes tracking movement, her tiny fists grasping at my fingers with a strength that seemed impossible for something so small. I fed her myself, against the advice of the physician who thought a wet nurse more appropriate for a woman of my station, because those moments of closeness were the only times I felt truly alive. I sang to her the lullabies my mother had sung to me, songs half remembered from a childhood that seemed to belong to another person entirely. I told her stories about the future we would have, the adventures we would share, the love that would shelter her from every storm. And still, Sebastian did not come. He did not hold her. He did not look at her. When we passed in the corridors, which was rare as I had begun to confine myself to the nursery and my chambers, he looked through us as though we were ghosts, insubstantial and unworthy of acknowledgement. Once, in the great hall, Charlotte began to cry just as Sebastian was crossing toward his study, and I saw him flinch at the sound, saw his shoulders tighten and his pace quicken, saw him flee from his own child as though her cries were arrows aimed at his heart. The servants whispered when they thought I could not hear. Speculation about the state of my marriage and the legitimacy of my child ran through the household like a fever, infecting everyone from the highest footman to the lowest scullery maid. They wondered whether the Duke would ever claim his daughter as his own. They wondered whether I would be cast out in disgrace, sent back to my father's house with my bastard child and my ruined reputation. They wondered, and they watched, and they waited for the axe to fall. The dowager's triumph was quiet but unmistakable. She did not gloat openly, for that would have been beneath her dignity. But I saw the satisfaction in her eyes whenever she passed the nursery door without entering, saw the small smile that played at the corners of her thin lips when Sebastian avoided any mention of his daughter. She had won. She had poisoned her son against me, had turned his old wounds into weapons aimed at my heart, had ensured that I would never truly belong in this house, no matter how long I remained within its walls. I began to make plans. Quietly, carefully. In the dark hours when Charlotte slept and the house was silent around me, I considered my options. I wrote to my brother in Suffolk, asking if his household might receive a visitor for an extended stay. I set aside what money I could from my household allowance, small amounts that would not be noticed, building a fund that might sustain me and Charlotte if we were forced to flee. I inventoried my jewelry, calculating what might be sold without attracting attention and what would need to be left behind. I did not know what the future held, but I knew with growing certainty that I could not remain in a house where my daughter was treated as though she did not exist, where her father refused to acknowledge her, where every day brought fresh wounds to a heart that was already bleeding. I would give Sebastian 1 more month. 1 more month to come to his senses, to see the truth that was evident in Charlotte's every feature, to choose his daughter over his fear. And if he did not, if he could not, then I would take my child and go, would build a life for us somewhere far from Ravenswood and its shadows and its bitter, beautiful master. And then came the night that changed everything. It was late March, and winter had finally begun to release its grip on the countryside. Charlotte was 3 weeks old, small but strong, with lungs powerful enough to wake the entire household when she was displeased. She had developed a cough that frightened me with its persistence, a rattling sound that seemed too large for such a tiny chest. The physician had come and gone, pronouncing it nothing serious, merely the result of a draft that had crept into the nursery, but I could not shake my worry. I sat with her through the night, rocking her in my arms and watching her small chest rise and fall with each labored breath. The fire had burned low in the grate, casting long shadows across the nursery walls, and I sang softly to soothe her coughing fits, old lullabies that my mother had sung to me in another lifetime. "Sleep, little one," I whispered against her downy head. "Sleep and grow strong. I will keep you safe. I will always keep you safe." It was past midnight when I first smelled the smoke. I thought at first that it was coming from the fireplace, that perhaps a log had shifted and sent sparks up the chimney. But the smell grew stronger, sharper, acrid in a way that made my throat tighten and my eyes water. And then I heard the shouting. "Fire!" someone screamed from somewhere below. "Fire in the east wing." I was on my feet before the words had finished echoing through the halls. Charlotte clutched to my chest, my heart pounding with a terror that went far beyond concern for property or possessions. The east wing, the locked wing, Vivian's wing, but also Sebastian's wing. His chambers were there. His study, his private rooms, all the spaces where he retreated from a world that had hurt him too deeply. I ran to the door and nearly collided with a wild-eyed footman who was rushing past, a bucket of water sloshing in his grip. "Your Grace," he gasped, "you must get out. The whole corridor is ablaze." "Where is the Duke?" I demanded, grabbing his arm with my free hand. "Where is my husband?" His face told me everything before his words confirmed it. "His Grace went in," he said, "to save something. We tried to stop him, but he would not listen." I thrust Charlotte into the arms of the first maid I saw, a startled young woman named Sarah, who had been running toward the servants' stairs with her nightcap askew and her face pale with fear. "Take her outside," I ordered. "Take her to the garden and do not let anyone else hold her. Do you understand me? No one else." Sarah nodded, too frightened to argue, and I watched her disappear down the corridor with my daughter before I turned and ran toward the orange glow that painted the walls of Ravenswood in hellish hues. I should not have gone. I knew it then, and I know it now. I was a mother, newly delivered, still weak from childbirth and the sleepless weeks that followed. I had a daughter who needed me, a child who would be orphaned if I died in that fire trying to save a man who had never shown me anything but coldness and rejection. But I went anyway. Because despite everything, despite the silence and the distance and the endless, aching loneliness of my marriage, I had come to love Sebastian Ravenswood. I loved him not for what he was, but for what I glimpsed beneath his armor. I loved the wounded boy he had been, and the man he might become if only someone could reach him. I loved him, and I could not let him die alone in a fire of his own making. The heat hit me first, a wave of furnace-hot air that stole my breath and made my eyes stream with tears. The East Wing corridor was an inferno, flames climbing the ancient tapestries and licking at the painted ceiling, smoke so thick I could barely see 3 feet in front of my face. I pulled my shawl over my nose and mouth and pushed forward, calling Sebastian's name until my throat was raw from the smoke and the screaming. I found him in what had been Vivian's sitting room. The door was open, flames licking at its frame, and through the smoke I could see him on his knees before a burning secretary desk. He was clutching something to his chest, some object he had risked his life to retrieve, and he did not seem to hear me when I called to him over the roar of the flames. "Sebastian!" I screamed, and still he did not move. "Sebastian, we have to go." I grabbed his arm and pulled, using strength I did not know I possessed, screaming at him that the ceiling was about to come down, that he would die if he stayed here trying to save whatever worthless relic he had come for. He turned to look at me, and in the flickering firelight I saw something I had never seen in his eyes before. Tears. Sebastian was crying, and not the controlled, dignified tears of a gentleman suppressing grief. These were the raw, ugly tears of a man whose soul was breaking, pouring down his soot-streaked face and cutting tracks through the ash like rivers through stone. I did not stop to wonder at this miracle. I hauled him to his feet with strength, born of desperation and terror and a love I had never admitted aloud. Together we stumbled through the burning corridor, dodging falling timbers and leaping over tongues of flame that seemed determined to claim us. The smoke was so thick I could barely see, could barely breathe, could only follow the distant glow of the main hall and pray that we would reach it before the fire reached us. We burst out of the East Wing door, just as the roof behind us collapsed with a roar that shook the very foundations of the house. The force of it knocked us to the ground, sent us sprawling across the cold stone of the courtyard, gasping and coughing, and gloriously, miraculously alive. Servants rushed to help us, their faces masks of shock and relief, as they realized the Duke and Duchess had survived. The physician who had been summoned for the fire came running to check us for burns, and I heard him exclaiming over the blisters on my hands and the singed ends of my hair. But I had eyes only for Sebastian, who lay beside me on the frozen ground, still clutching whatever he had risked both our lives to save. It was a small wooden box I saw now, scorched but intact, its brass hinges blackened by heat but still holding. And when it fell open in Sebastian's shaking hands, spilling its contents across the soot-stained stone, I saw that it contained letters. Dozens of letters, written in a feminine hand I did not recognize, tied with ribbons that had half burned away. Love letters. Vivian's love letters to Lord Ashworth, the proof of her betrayal that Sebastian had kept all these years. "Proof," Sebastian whispered, his voice a ragged whisper barely audible above the crackling of the dying fire. "I kept them. Proof of what she did. I thought, when I confronted her, I thought I might need proof someday, that someone might not believe me, that they might think I was the villain in our story. So I kept her letters to him, her love letters to Ashworth. All this time I kept them, and I could not let them burn." He looked at me then, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time since our wedding day. And I saw him clearly too, saw past the ice and the walls and the armor he had built to protect himself. I saw a man who had been so devastated by betrayal that he had kept the evidence of it like a wound he could not stop touching, a pain he could not allow to heal, because healing would mean forgetting, and forgetting would mean risking it all over again. Sebastian had not kept those letters as weapons. He had kept them as wounds, as proof of his own unworthiness, as evidence that he had been fool enough to love a woman who had never loved him back. Every time he looked at those letters, he was reminded of his failure, his gullibility, his broken heart. And he had carried that burden for years, letting it fester and poison every chance at happiness that came his way, including me, including our daughter. "Sebastian," I said, and my voice was gentler than I had any right to feel after everything he had put me through. "Sebastian, look at me." He raised his head, and I saw him clearly then. Not the cold duke, not the distant husband, not the man who had refused to hold his own child. I saw the wounded boy who had loved too deeply and paid too dearly, who had built walls so high that he had forgotten there was anyone inside worth protecting. "Charlotte is your daughter," I said. "I have never been unfaithful to you. I have never even thought of being unfaithful to you." Lord Thornwood was a dance partner at a ball, nothing more. I spoke with him because I was lonely, because my husband would not look at me, because for 1 hour I wanted to feel like a woman rather than a piece of furniture. But I never betrayed you. I never would have betrayed you. And the fact that you believed your mother's lies over my truth tells me more about your wounds than it does about my character. I took a breath, feeling the cold air burn in my smoke-raw lungs. Your mother has poisoned your mind because she cannot bear to see you happy. She has fed your fears because your misery gives her power. And you have let her, because believing me false is easier than risking your heart again. But I am not Vivian. I will never be Vivian. And if you cannot see that, then I will take our daughter and go somewhere she will be loved as she deserves, even if that love comes only from me. The words hung between us, sharp as broken glass, and for a long moment Sebastian simply stared at me as though I had spoken in a language he did not understand. Then something crumpled in his face, some last defense finally crashing down, and he made a sound that was half sob and half laugh and entirely broken. "I know," he said. "God help me, Arabella, I know. I have known from the beginning that you were different, that you were true, that you deserved so much better than what I have given you. But I was afraid. I am still afraid. The thought of loving you, of truly loving you, and losing you as I lost her, it was more than I could bear. So I kept you at a distance. I told myself that if I never let you in, you could never tear me apart the way she did." "And Charlotte?" I asked, because I needed to hear him say it, needed to hear him acknowledge what his fear had cost us all. His face twisted with anguish. "Every time I look at her, I see everything I might lose, everything that could be taken from me. I could not hold her because holding her would make her real, would make my love for her real, and then I would be vulnerable again. Then I would have something that could be used to destroy me." He covered his face with his burned and blackened hands, and his shoulders shook with sobs that seemed to rise from some bottomless well of grief. I watched him break apart on the frozen stones of his ancestral home, watched the walls finally crumble and the ice finally melt, and I felt something shift inside my own chest. Some hardened knot of anger and hurt began to loosen, despite everything it had cost me to tie it tight. I did not forgive him in that moment. Forgiveness would take time, would require more than tears and confessions in the aftermath of near death. But I understood him, finally and completely, and understanding was the first step on a road I had not known we would ever walk together. "Come," I said, rising and offering him my hand. It was burned across the palm, blistered and beginning to ache, but I held it out anyway. "Come and meet your daughter." He looked at my hand as though it were a foreign object, something he could not quite identify. Then, slowly, with the hesitation of a man stepping onto ice, he does not trust to hold his weight. He took it and let me pull him to his feet. We walked back into the house together, past the chaos of the firefighting efforts, past the scorched and smoking ruins of the East Wing, past servants who stared at us with undisguised astonishment. We climbed the stairs to the nursery, my hand still clasped in his, neither of us willing to let go now that we had finally found each other. Sarah was there, rocking Charlotte and singing softly to soothe her fretful cries. She looked up at our entrance with wide eyes, taking in our soot-streaked faces and burned clothing and clasped hands, and something like wonder passed across her young face. "The baby is well, Your Grace," she said to me. She fussed a bit from the noise, but she settled once the shouting stopped. Sebastian stopped in the doorway, and I felt his hand tighten convulsively on mine. I looked up at his face and saw naked terror there, the kind of fear that comes not from physical danger, but from the prospect of emotional annihilation. He was afraid of his own daughter, afraid of what loving her might do to him. Afraid of the vulnerability that came with holding something so small and precious and utterly dependent upon his protection. "Sarah," I said quietly, "please give the child to His Grace." The maid's eyes went wide, darting between Sebastian and me as though checking for signs of madness. But she was a servant, trained to obey, and she rose without argument and crossed to where Sebastian stood frozen in the doorway. "Here, Your Grace," she said, and her voice was surprisingly gentle. "Here is your daughter." She placed Charlotte in Sebastian's arms before he could refuse, before he could retreat, before he could do anything but stand there and hold the small, warm weight of the child he had denied for 3 weeks. I watched his face as he looked down at her, watched the terror and the longing and the desperate, desperate love that he had tried so hard to suppress. Charlotte, for her part, seemed unimpressed by the drama of the moment. She blinked up at her father with cloudy gray eyes and then yawned enormously, displaying toothless gums and a tiny pink tongue, as though the events of the evening had been rather tedious from her perspective. "She has your chin," I said softly, "and your coloring. Look at her eyes. They are the same shade as yours." Sebastian did not respond. He was staring at Charlotte with an intensity that seemed almost painful, his eyes traveling over her features as though memorizing every line and curve. His hands, which had been steady enough to pull me from a burning building, trembled now as they cradled his daughter. Then his attention caught on something, and his entire body went rigid. "What is this?" he asked, his voice strange and distant. "Arabella. What is this, Mark?" He had turned Charlotte slightly in his arms, exposing the soft nape of her neck where her dark hair was still thin enough to reveal the skin beneath. There, clearly visible in the lamplight, was a birthmark. It was small, no larger than my thumbnail, shaped like a crescent moon, and it sat just at the base of her skull where her neck met her shoulders. I had noticed it, of course. I had noticed everything about my daughter in those 3 weeks of solitary motherhood, had catalogued every finger and toe and tiny imperfection with the obsessive attention of new parenthood. But I had thought nothing of it beyond a minor variation, a small, distinguishing mark that would help me find her in a crowd of other babies if ever such a situation arose. I was wrong. I was so wonderfully, miraculously wrong. "The Ravenswood mark," Sebastian breathed, and his voice cracked on the words like ice breaking under pressure. "My father had it. His father had it. I have it. Every firstborn child in the Ravenswood line for 6 generations has carried this mark. It is said to come from an ancestor who was blessed by the moon, or cursed, depending on which version of the story you believe." He looked up at me, and the tears were flowing freely now, cutting tracks through the soot and ash that covered his face. But these were not the desperate tears of the fire. These were something else entirely: relief, joy, the breaking of chains he had worn so long he had forgotten they were there. "She is mine," he said. "She is truly mine. Not because you told me, not because I chose to believe, but because she carries the proof in her very flesh. She is mine, and I almost lost her. I almost lost both of you." He sank to his knees, still holding Charlotte, and I went to him and knelt beside him and wrapped my arms around them both. We stayed there for a long time, the 3 of us, while the house bustled around us and the east wing smoldered and the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the windows. We stayed there, and I felt something begin to grow in the ashes of our broken marriage, something small and tender and frightened but undeniably alive. The weeks that followed were not easy. Nothing worthwhile ever is. Sebastian had to confront his mother, which he did the very next day in a conversation I was not privy to, but which the servants later described as volcanic. The dowager emerged from his study white-faced and shaking. Her perfect composure cracked for the first time anyone could remember. She did not speak to me as she passed, did not look at me, did not acknowledge my existence in any way. She simply walked to her chambers and began to pack. She left Ravenswood Hall before the week was out, retiring to a dower house on the far edge of the estate, where she would live out her remaining years in bitter isolation. I never saw her again, though I heard reports of her health declining rapidly once she was removed from the house she had ruled for so many years. I cannot say I mourned her passing when it finally came. Some wounds are too deep for forgiveness, some cruelties too calculated for mercy. Sebastian had to learn how to be a father, which was perhaps even more difficult than facing down the dowager. He was awkward and uncertain at first, holding Charlotte as though she were made of the finest porcelain and might shatter at any moment. He did not know how to soothe her cries or interpret her needs, and he looked to me constantly for guidance with an expression of such naked vulnerability that it broke my heart anew each time I saw it. But he learned. Day by day, feeding by feeding, sleepless night by sleepless night, he learned the rhythms of parenthood. I watched the ice around his heart melt a little more each time Charlotte wrapped her tiny fingers around his thumb. I watched him smile, really smile, for the first time since I had known him, when she gurgled up at him from her cradle. I watched him become the man he might have been if Vivian had never existed, the man who had been buried beneath years of pain and self-protection, and he had to learn how to be a husband. This was the hardest lesson of all because it required him to do what he had spent years avoiding, to open himself to the possibility of love and the certainty of vulnerability that came with it. We talked endlessly in those early weeks of our renewed marriage. We talked about Vivian and the wounds she had left behind. We talked about his fears and his walls and the armor he had built so high that he had almost suffocated behind it. We talked about my loneliness and my hurt and the plans I had made to leave him, which shocked him deeply and seemed to drive home how close he had come to losing everything. We talked about the future and what it might look like if we were brave enough to build it together. One conversation stands out above all the others, a conversation that happened late one night when Charlotte had finally settled after hours of fretful crying. We were both exhausted, dark circles under our eyes, and our clothing rumpled from the endless cycle of feeding and soothing and hoping for sleep that never seemed to come. Sebastian had taken to sharing my chambers, unwilling to be separated from Charlotte, even for the few hours of rest we managed to steal, and we lay together in the darkness, too tired to sleep and too raw to pretend. "Tell me about your first marriage," I said, surprising myself with the boldness of the question. "Tell me what it was really like, not what the servants whisper or what society assumes. Tell me the truth." Sebastian was quiet for so long that I thought he would refuse, thought he would retreat behind his walls, as he had done so many times before. But then he began to speak, his voice low and rough in the darkness, and the story he told me was both better and worse than anything I had imagined. He had loved Vivian with the blind, consuming passion of youth. He had been 23 when they married, inexperienced in the ways of women and society, convinced that his love alone could conquer any obstacle. She had been so beautiful, he said, so dazzling, so full of life. He had felt chosen by a goddess, blessed beyond any deserving, and he had offered her his heart without reservation or self-protection. The first year had been happy, or so he had believed. Looking back, he could see the signs he had missed, the small cruelties and casual dishonesties that hinted at the truth beneath her glittering surface. But he had been too in love to see clearly, too desperate to believe in the fairy tale he had constructed. "I gave her everything," he said, his voice cracking. "My heart, my trust, my entire being. I would have walked through fire for her, would have sacrificed anything she asked. And she looked at all of it, at everything I was and everything I offered, and she found it wanting. She found me wanting. She told me I was boring and cold, and that lying beneath me was a duty she could barely endure. I reached for him in the darkness and felt his tears wet against my palm. "Sebastian," I whispered. But he shook his head. "No, let me finish. I need to finish." The discovery of her affair had nearly destroyed him. He had confronted her hoping for denial, for explanation, for anything that might preserve the illusion he had clung to so desperately. Instead, she had confirmed everything and added salt to every wound. "She laughed at me," he said. When I asked her how she could do this, how she could betray me so completely, she laughed. She said I was a fool to think anyone could love me, that I was useful for my title and my fortune, but as a man, I was nothing. She said she had never felt anything for me but contempt, that even on our wedding night she had been thinking of other lovers, that every moment of tenderness I remembered was a performance designed to keep me compliant. I held him while he wept, feeling his pain as though it were my own. This was the wound that had never healed, the shame he had carried for years, the reason he had built walls so high that no one could ever hurt him again. Not just that Vivian had betrayed him, but that she had made him feel worthless, unlovable, a fool for daring to love at all. "You are not worthless," I said fiercely. "You are not unlovable. Vivian was the fool, not you. She had everything, Sebastian, everything, and she threw it away for what? For a man who abandoned her, for a scandal that ruined her, for a death alone and unmourned in a foreign country. You survived, you endured, and you found the courage to love again, to let me in, to hold your daughter. That is not weakness. That is the bravest thing I have ever seen." He raised his head and looked at me in the darkness, his eyes red-rimmed and vulnerable. "Do you really believe that?" "I believe it with my whole heart," I told him, "and I will spend the rest of my life proving it to you." There were setbacks. There were nights when he retreated behind his walls again, when some old ghost whispered in his ear and he looked at me with suspicion that cut like a blade. But those nights grew fewer and further between, and he always came back. He always apologized. He always tried again. I learned to be patient with his healing, as he learned to be patient with mine. We were two wounded people trying to become whole together, and if the process was sometimes painful, it was also sometimes beautiful beyond anything I had imagined possible. Spring came to Ravenswood, and with it a transformation that extended beyond the greening of the gardens and the warming of the air. Sebastian began to smile, small quirks of his lips, at first that gradually grew into something fuller and more genuine. He laughed one evening at something Charlotte did, a proper laugh that rang through the halls and made the servants look at each other in astonishment, and I felt tears prick at my eyes because I had never heard that sound before, and it was more beautiful than any music. He reached for my hand as we walked the grounds together, his fingers intertwining with mine as naturally as if he had been doing it for years. He told me I was beautiful, and his eyes held warmth that made the words more than empty courtesy. He began to join me for breakfast and dinner, abandoning his solitary meals in the study, and the dining room that had once felt so cold and empty began to feel like a place where a family might gather. He told me he loved me on a night in May when the moon was full and the air was sweet with the scent of blooming roses. We were in the garden, Charlotte asleep in her nursery with a capable nurse watching over her, and Sebastian had been unusually quiet all through dinner. I thought perhaps he was retreating again. Perhaps the old fears had returned, and I was preparing myself for another round of patient understanding when he stopped walking and turned to face me. "I have been trying to find the words," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion. "I have been trying to find the right words for weeks now, but they do not exist. There is no language adequate to express what I need to tell you, so I will simply say it plainly, and hope you can hear everything I mean beneath the inadequacy of speech. He took both my hands in his, and his grip was trembling. "I love you, Arabella. I love you in a way I did not know I was capable of. Not anymore. I thought that part of me had died with my first marriage, had been buried beneath bitterness and betrayal until nothing remained but ash and bone. But you found it. You watered it with your patience and your grace and your refusal to give up on me, even when giving up would have been the wisest course. You brought me back to life, and I do not know how to thank you except to spend the rest of my days trying to be worthy of the gift you have given me." I wept then, tears streaming down my face in the moonlight, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of release, of joy, of a hope fulfilled that I had long since stopped believing in. I told him I loved him too, words I had never spoken to him before, though I had felt them growing in my heart for longer than I cared to admit. I told him I forgave him, fully and completely, for every cold glance and every silent meal, and every night spent alone in my marriage bed. I told him that he was already worthy, that he had been worthy all along, that his only sin was being too afraid to see it. He kissed me then, and it was nothing like the dutiful kisses of our early marriage. It was fire and tenderness and desperation and homecoming all at once. And when we finally drew apart, both breathless and shaking, I saw in his eyes the man he might have been if Vivian had never existed. I saw the man he could still become, was becoming, with every day that we chose each other anew. That summer was the happiest of my life. Sebastian threw himself into being a father with the same intensity he had once devoted to keeping the world at arm's length, and Charlotte thrived under the warmth of his attention. He carried her everywhere, showing her off to the tenants with a pride that bordered on absurd. He commissioned a portrait of her that now hangs in the gallery alongside generations of Ravenswood heirs. He read to her in the evenings, his deep voice rumbling through nursery rhymes and fairy tales that made me smile from my chair by the fire. And he loved me, openly, unashamedly, with a passion that still made me blush when he reached for me in the darkness of our shared chamber. We became partners in truth as well as in law, discussing the estate and the tenants and the future we were building together. He valued my opinions and sought my counsel and treated me as an equal in a way that few husbands of our time would have considered proper. I flourished under his regard, blooming like the roses in our garden, becoming a version of myself I had not known existed. The lonely girl who had arrived at Ravenswood with nothing but naive hopes and a trousseau that spoke of modest means began to disappear, replaced by a woman who knew her worth and claimed her place and stood tall beside her husband as his partner and his equal. We did not forget the pain of our early marriage. I do not think either of us ever truly could. There are scars that remain even when wounds have healed, reminders of what we survived and what we almost lost. But we chose not to let those scars define us. We chose to let them teach us instead, to let them serve as warnings against complacency and reminders of how fragile happiness can be if it is not tended with care. Charlotte grew, as children do, faster than seemed possible. Her first word was "Papa," which delighted Sebastian to an almost embarrassing degree and prompted him to spend hours attempting to coax her to say it again. Her first steps were taken in the great hall of Ravenswood, toddling between her father's outstretched hands and my encouraging smile, and when she finally reached him and he swept her up in his arms with a laugh of pure joy, I thought my heart would burst from the fullness of it. She inherited Sebastian's gray eyes and my stubborn chin and a temperament all her own, fierce and sweet and utterly fearless. The servants adored her. The tenants brought her gifts of flowers and hand-carved toys. And the birthmark at the nape of her neck remained, a small crescent moon that marked her as a Ravenswood as surely as any family crest or ancient title. On Charlotte's first birthday, we held a celebration that brought the entire county to our doors. There was music and dancing and enough food to feed an army, and Sebastian stood at my side through all of it, his hand at the small of my back, his smile brighter than the hundreds of candles that illuminated the ballroom. When the last guest had departed and the servants had begun the long work of cleaning up, we climbed the stairs to the nursery together and stood looking down at our sleeping daughter. "Thank you," Sebastian said quietly. "Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for staying when you had every reason to go. Thank you for her." I leaned into his embrace and felt his arms tighten around me, strong and sure and steady. "Thank you for finally letting me in," I replied. "Thank you for being brave enough to love us." We stood there for a long time, watching Charlotte sleep, and I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment, the loneliness and the heartbreak and the fire that had nearly consumed us all. The moment when Sebastian had finally held his daughter and seen the proof of her heritage written in her very flesh. The slow, painful process of rebuilding trust from the ruins of fear and betrayal. The love that had grown in the most unlikely of soils, nurtured by patience and grace and the stubborn refusal to stop hoping. I had come to Ravenswood a bride full of naive dreams, and those dreams had been shattered one by one until I thought nothing remained but dust. But from that dust, something new had grown, something stronger and more beautiful than anything I had imagined in my girlish fantasies. A love tested by fire and found worthy. A family forged in the crucible of suffering and emerged refined like gold. I must pause here to tell you of a moment that remains etched in my memory with crystalline clarity, a moment that came perhaps 6 months after the fire, when our new life together was still fragile and new. Sebastian had taken to walking the grounds with Charlotte in his arms each morning, a ritual that had begun as a physician's suggestion for fresh air and had become something sacred. I watched them from the window of my sitting room one morning, my husband and my daughter silhouetted against the rising sun, and I saw him stop at the edge of the lake and point toward the water. I could not hear what he was saying, but I could see his lips moving, see the animation in his face as he explained something to a baby far too young to understand. Charlotte reached out her small hand toward whatever had captured her father's attention, and Sebastian laughed, a sound I could hear even through the glass, a sound that still had the power to make my heart skip. He turned then, as though sensing my gaze, and he looked up at my window with an expression that made my knees weak even after months of marriage. He raised his free hand in a wave, and Charlotte imitated the gesture with her own tiny fingers, and I felt tears slide down my cheeks because I had never dared to dream of such simple, perfect happiness. That evening, Sebastian came to me in the library where I was reading by the fire. He sat down across from me and was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the flames dancing in the grate. "I have been thinking," he said finally, "about the day Charlotte was born. About all the days after, when I refused to see her, refused to hold her, refused to be her father." I set aside my book, giving him my full attention. We had spoken of this before many times, but I could tell from his tone that this was different somehow. "I have been trying to understand," he continued, "how I could have been so cruel. How I could have looked at my own child and felt nothing but fear. And I think I finally understand it." He met my eyes, and his own were bright with unshed tears. "I was not refusing to hold her," he said. "I was refusing to hold myself. I was so terrified of my own capacity for love, so convinced that love only led to devastation, that I could not allow myself to feel it. When I looked at Charlotte, I saw not just my daughter, but all the pain that loving her might bring. I saw Vivian's lies reflected in every infant feature I was too afraid to examine closely. I saw my own weakness, my own vulnerability, my own capacity for destruction. He rose and came to kneel before my chair, taking my hands in his. "You broke through that," he said. "You and she together. You showed me that love does not have to mean annihilation, that vulnerability does not have to mean destruction, that I could hold my daughter without losing myself, could love you without betraying my own survival." I pulled him up to sit beside me and held him as he wept, as he released grief I had not known he still carried. We sat together until the fire burned low and the candles guttered in their holders, and when he finally raised his head, I saw peace in his eyes that I had never seen before. The reconstruction of the East Wing took nearly 2 years to complete. Sebastian oversaw every detail himself, determined that the space which had once held so much pain would be transformed into something beautiful. When it was finally finished, he took me by the hand and led me through the renovated rooms, showing me the new library with its floor-to-ceiling windows, the sitting room with its pale yellow walls and comfortable furniture, the bedchambers that would one day house our growing family. This was Vivian's domain, he said, standing in the center of what had been her private sitting room. Everything in this wing reminded me of her, of my failure, of my shame. I could not bear to enter it, could not bear to change it, could not bear to let it go. So I locked it away and pretended it did not exist, the same way I locked away my heart. He turned to face me, his expression solemn. But now, he continued, it is ours, this wing, this house, this life. I want no more locked rooms between us, Arabella. No more secrets, no more hidden pain, no more parts of myself that I keep separate from you. I give you all of me, the broken pieces and the healing ones, the memories I cannot escape, and the future I want to build. Will you accept them? I answered him not with words, but with a kiss that said everything language could not convey. And when we finally drew apart, I saw that he was smiling, truly smiling, with a joy that transformed his face and made him look like the young man he must have been before life taught him to be afraid. The years that followed brought joys and sorrows in their wake, as years always do. We had 2 more children, a son named Edward, who inherited Sebastian's serious temperament, and a daughter named Rose, who was as wild and free as the flower for which she was named. The nursery that had once held only 1 crib expanded to hold 3, and Ravenswood Hall rang with the sounds of children's laughter and running feet and all the beautiful chaos of a family growing together. Sebastian's hair silvered at the temples, and lines appeared around my eyes, and we grew old together in the great house that had once felt so much like a prison and now felt entirely like home. We weathered storms and celebrated triumphs. We buried friends and welcomed grandchildren. We loved each other through sickness and health, through disagreements and reconciliations, through all the ordinary days that make up a life shared with another person. He never retreated behind his walls again, not once in all those years. The armor he had worn so long was gone, melted away by love and fatherhood, and the simple daily practice of being present for his family. If sometimes I saw shadows in his eyes that spoke of old pain never quite forgotten, I understood that some wounds leave scars that never fully fade, and I loved him all the more for the courage it took to keep those scars exposed to the light. Charlotte grew into a remarkable young woman, as fierce and sweet as she had been as a child. She made her debut in London society and caused quite a stir with her intelligence and her beauty, and her complete disregard for the simpering behavior expected of young ladies of quality. I remember the night of her first ball with particular vividness. Sebastian and I had traveled to London for the season, something we rarely did as he had never lost his distaste for society's empty pageantry. But for Charlotte's debut, we had made an exception. We stood at the edge of the ballroom, watching our daughter navigate the treacherous waters of the Tun with a grace that made my heart swell with pride. "She is magnificent," Sebastian murmured, his hand finding mine in the crush of silk and superficiality, "just like her mother." I squeezed his fingers and smiled up at him. "She has your stubbornness, and your eyes. Have you noticed how the young men orbit around her like planets around the sun?" Sebastian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I have noticed. I have also noticed that young Ashford who keeps asking her to dance. His family connections are impeccable, but I do not like the way he looks at her." I laughed softly. "You would not like the way any young man looked at her. She is your daughter, your firstborn, your little Charlotte, who used to fall asleep on your chest while you read to her from books she could not possibly understand. He had the grace to look slightly abashed. "Is it so obvious?" "Only to someone who loves you," I assured him. "Only to someone who remembers how fiercely you fought to let yourself love her in the first place." His expression softened at the memory, and he raised my hand to his lips. "Thank God you made me fight," he said against my knuckles. "Thank God you did not give up on me." Charlotte chose her own husband in the end, as I had known she would. He was a young viscount named William Hartley, a scholar with kind eyes and a wit sharp enough to match her own. Sebastian interrogated him mercilessly when William came to ask for Charlotte's hand, but I could see the approval hiding beneath the paternal ferocity, could see that Sebastian recognized in William the qualities that would make Charlotte happy. The wedding was held at Ravenswood, in the chapel where Sebastian and I had renewed our vows 5 years after the fire, in a ceremony witnessed by our children and a few close friends. Charlotte wore my mother's pearls and a gown of white silk that made her look like an angel descended to earth, and when Sebastian walked her down the aisle, his eyes glistening with unshed tears, I saw in his face all the love he had once been afraid to feel. "She is happy," he said to me later that night, as we stood on the terrace watching the stars emerge one by one. "She is happy, and she will be loved, and she will have the marriage we almost did not have. How can I ever thank you for that?" "You already have," I replied, leaning into his embrace. "Every day that you loved her, every moment that you let yourself be her father, every time you held her without fear. That is all the thanks I will ever need." Charlotte fell in love with a young viscount who adored her, and when she married him in the chapel at Ravenswood, Sebastian wept openly at the wedding breakfast and did not care who saw. Edward took over the management of the estate after Sebastian's strength began to fail, proving himself as capable and conscientious as his father had ever been. Rose scandalously attended university and became a scholar of ancient languages, and we could not have been prouder of her for it, though society was somewhat less approving. Through it all, I remained at Ravenswood, the Duchess who had come as a stranger and become the heart of the house. I tended my greenhouse and raised my children and loved my husband, and I counted myself among the most fortunate women who had ever lived. On the night before Sebastian died, half a century after that fire in the East Wing, he held my hand in his and smiled at me with all the love that had grown between us over our long life together. His grip was weak, his skin paper-thin and marked with the spots of age, but his eyes were still clear, still the same frost gray that had seemed so cold when I first met him and had become the warmest color I knew. "I have been so lucky," he said, his voice thin and weak, but still unmistakably his. "So impossibly lucky that you came into my life and refused to leave it. You saved me, Arabella, in every way that a person can be saved." I kissed his forehead and told him that he had saved me too. I told him that I loved him, had always loved him, would love him still when we met again in whatever came after this life. I told him that I would see him there, in a garden that never ended, where the roses bloomed eternal, and there was no more pain or fear or loss. He smiled and closed his eyes and slipped away so peacefully that I barely knew the moment he was gone. I remained at Ravenswood for 3 more years after his passing, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who filled the halls with life. The nursery where I had first placed Charlotte in Sebastian's arms became a schoolroom and then a playroom, and then a library for a great-grandson who loved books as much as I had loved them. The garden where Sebastian had first told me he loved me remained a place of pilgrimage for me, a spot where I could sit and remember and feel close to him again. On the last day of my life, I dreamed of him. He was young again, as he had been when we first met, but his eyes held none of the frost that had made him so distant. He stood in the garden where he had finally said the words I had longed to hear, surrounded by roses in full bloom, and he held out his hand to me with a smile that held all the warmth of 50 years of love. I took it without hesitation, and together we walked into a light so bright and warm that I felt no fear at all. "I love you," I said, the words coming as easily as breath. "I know," he replied. "I have always known, even when I was too afraid to admit it." And then we were together, as we were always meant to be, and the story that had begun with such sorrow ended in a joy beyond anything I had ever imagined. This is the story of how I loved a man who was too broken to love me back, and how I stayed anyway, and how in the end, love proved stronger than fear. This is the story of my daughter, born under a cloud of suspicion and proved by a mark no one could deny. This is the story of Ravenswood and the family that rose from its ashes. This is my story, and if I could live it again, with all its pain and all its heartbreak and all its fear, I would not change a single moment, because every moment led to him and to her and to the life we built together out of nothing but hope and stubborn love. Remember me kindly, you who hear these words. Remember that even in the darkest winter, spring is waiting. Remember that even the coldest heart can learn to beat again. Remember that love, true love, is worth any suffering it costs to find and keep. And if you find yourself in a marriage that feels like a prison, or loving someone who cannot seem to love you back, remember my story. Remember that I was once where you are now, lost and lonely and ready to give up. Remember that I stayed, and that staying was the hardest and bravest thing I ever did. Remember, and do not lose hope, for hope is all we have in the end. Hope and love, and the courage to keep reaching for both, even when the night seems endless and the dawn will never come. The dawn always comes. I promise you that. It always comes.